This is Africa in 1914. By this year, almost the entire continent of Africa had been divided up and was ruled by European power. This invasion, occupation, and colonization of Africa by European power, which occurred so rapidly between 1870 and 1913, is known as the Scramble for Africa, or the Race for Africa. The countries which competed in the Scramble for Africa were Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. By 1913, they had colonized the whole of Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia. There were numerous reasons for the Scramble for Africa. A number of these were linked to the Industrial Revolution, which occurred in Europe towards the end of the 19th century. They were looking for resources and raw materials in Africa. After the discovery of gold and diamonds in southern Africa, they started to look for mineral wealth. The Europeans wanted a new market for their manufactured goods. They wanted to invest capital in Africa for high profits. The Europeans were overpopulated and wanted new areas where they could resettle. Machines replaced human labor, thus creating unemployment. There were also other reasons for the Scramble for Africa, such as prestige, humanitarian, strategic, and religious. European countries wanted to gain more colonies for prestigious reasons because the more colonies a country had, the more powerful it was considered. There was a rise in nationalism in Europe, and the possession of colonies became a symbol of superiority. There were also strategic reasons. After the construction of the Suez Canal, Egypt became very valuable. Europeans had a humanitarian motive of stopping slave trade in Africa. There was a boom in African exploration, and some colonies were established by explorers such as Cecil John Rhodes. There were religious reasons, as missionaries wanted to convert African tribes to Christianity. King Leopold II of Belgium took the lead in the race and erected the Congo Free State, which was then annexed by Belgium in 1907. Germany annexed Togoland and Cameroon in 1884, followed by East Africa and Southwest Africa. France had already colonized Algeria in the mid-19th century, and by 1900, France had seized Tunis, Madagascar, Ivory Coast, and the Saharan Desert, as well as Senegal and Morocco. The Italians, Portuguese, and Spaniards were less successful in their colonizations. Portugal annexed Angola and Mozambique. Spain secured the Canary Islands and some other islands on the Guinea coast. The Italians annexed Eritrea, Italian Somaliland in the east, Libya, and Tripoli. Cecil John Rhodes ensured that Britain gained a major portion of Africa. He set up colonies in South Africa, Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. Gold Coast and Sierra Leone were then captured, followed by Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, Somaliland, and Sudan. By the end of the 19th century, Britain had over 5,000 million square miles of Africa under its control. There were both positive and negative results to the Scramble for Africa. Unfortunately, most of these results were positive for the Europeans but negative for the Africans. The Europeans drew borders between the colonies, disregarding the fact that they were dividing up kingdoms and chiefdoms, and this caused conflict between tribes. The Africans were forced to pay taxes to the Europeans. They became inferior and were treated with brutality and like slaves. In this photo we can see that those that could not work in the rubber plantations got their hands cut off. The Africans became dependent on European manufactured goods and lost their self-sufficiency. In this photograph, the Africans are all wearing European clothing. All the best land was taken by the Europeans so that the Africans could not grow enough food to feed themselves. The Europeans became wealthy from Africa's wealth of minerals and raw materials, but the Africans did not share in this wealth. In this photograph you can see that the Africans were emaciated and starving. In the photograph you can see African forests and grasslands were cleared for plantations and to build railway lines. There were also some effects that were positive for Africa. Christianity spread throughout Africa. Education and medicines were introduced to Africa. Africa became more industrialized. Railroads and mail delivery systems were brought to Africa, thus revolutionizing travel and communication. The European scramble for Africa had many effects on the Africans at the time of colonization, but many of these effects would influence the lives of Africans for many years to come. The Europeans did bring new technology and education with them which benefited Africa. Communication and transport in Africa also improved as a result of the scramble for Africa. Christianity spread throughout the continent. There were, however, consequences to the scramble for Africa, which had some long-term effects on Africans as well as the Europeans. The arbitrary boundaries which the Europeans had made to divide up Africa created divisions between nations and resulted in civil wars which are still raging in Africa today. Since the Europeans took most of the valuable resources in Africa, leaving the Africans with very little, a large gap began to develop between the rich and poor, and this gap still exists today. The Europeans were also affected by their colonization of Africa. The extreme competition which existed between the European nations led to conflict and ultimately to World War One. To conclude, the negative impacts of the scramble for Africa far outweigh the positive. European culture and technology needed to be introduced to Africa, but it should have been done in a manner in which the consequences were more carefully thought out and less motivated by pride and greed.